The courthouse hallway smelled of old wood and broken promises. 7-year-old Sarah Mitchell sat on a wooden bench, her legs barely touching the cold floor, swinging them back and forth in a rhythm that matched her racing heartbeat. She wore a pink dress that her mother had insisted on, the one her father said made her look too grown up. Her brown hair was braided meticulously by her mother's hands that morning, hands that had trembled slightly as they worked. Sarah remembered her mother's voice, tight and strained. "You need to look nice today, sweetheart. You need to look happy." But Sarah wasn't happy. Sarah hadn't been happy in what felt like forever. Next to her sat Max, a 3-year-old golden retriever with fur the color of autumn leaves. The dog had been a gift from Sarah's paternal grandmother just 8 months ago, a gift delivered with a quiet note that read, "For the light in this darkness." At the time, Sarah didn't understand the note. She was only 6 then, still young enough to believe that her parents' fighting was temporary, a phase that would pass like winter always passes. But winter had turned into spring, spring into summer, and summer into the endless, aching fall of courtroom dates and custody evaluations. Now at 7, Sarah understood the note perfectly. Max wasn't just a pet. He was a lifeline. Her parents' divorce had started like so many do, with arguments about money, about time, about priorities. Sarah's father, Michael Mitchell, was a successful architect who traveled frequently for work. Sarah's mother, Jennifer, was a high school teacher who had sacrificed her career advancement to raise Sarah. The conflict between them had begun slowly, with bitter comments disguised as jokes. Then came the raised voices, the slammed doors. The nights when Sarah would lie in bed, pressing her ear against the wall, trying to understand what she had done wrong. Because in the way of children everywhere, she assumed her parents' unhappiness was somehow her fault. By the time the lawyers got involved, the situation had become a war. Michael's attorney painted Jennifer as a controlling woman who used Sarah as a weapon, keeping her from her father, filling her head with negative stories. Jennifer's lawyer countered with accusations of Michael's negligence, his emotional unavailability, his failure to be present in his daughter's life. Each side presented their case with ruthless precision, as if they were arguing about property division or debt allocation, rather than a child's heart and future. But nobody seemed to care what Sarah actually felt. The first sign of her deterioration came in early spring. Her second-grade teacher, Mrs. Henderson, called Jennifer for a conference. Sarah had stopped raising her hand in class. She sat at her desk with a distant expression, staring out the window. When called upon, she would answer in whispers, if at all. Her math scores, which had always been strong, began to slip. More concerning, Sarah had stopped eating lunch. The other children reported that she would simply sit with her tray, moving food around with her plastic fork, never actually consuming anything. Jennifer had cried when Mrs. Henderson told her this. She called Michael immediately, her voice accusatory. "This is what your fighting is doing to her. She's suffering because of you." Michael had shouted back, denying responsibility, blaming her for the conflict. That conversation had spiraled into another argument, one that Sarah could hear clearly from her bedroom upstairs. She had buried her face in her pillow, trying to muffle the sound of her own crying. Things got worse after that. Sarah developed stomach aches that sent her to the school nurse's office at least twice a week. She started having trouble sleeping, lying awake for hours, her mind racing with anxious thoughts. What if her parents' fighting was about her? What if her father really didn't want to see her, as her mother sometimes hinted? What if her mother's sadness was something she could fix if she were just good enough, quiet enough, perfect enough? The anxiety manifested in physical ways. Sarah began pulling at her hair without realizing it, a habit her mother noticed and immediately tried to stop. She developed a nervous habit of biting her nails down to the quick, often until they bled. At night, she would wake up gasping from nightmares she couldn't remember. Dark circles appeared under her eyes, giving her a haunted appearance that broke her grandmother's heart. When Sarah's father came for his scheduled visits, she would cling to him desperately, terrified that this would be the last time she saw him. When it was time for him to leave, she would have full panic attacks, sobbing so intensely that she couldn't breathe. Yet when she was with her mother, Sarah felt the weight of her mother's sadness and tried to comfort her instead of the other way around. She became a caretaker to her depressed parent, a role no 7-year-old should ever have to play. The grandmother, Mitchell, had watched this unfold with growing horror. She had been present for some of the worst arguments, had heard the things Michael and Jennifer said to each other, had witnessed the collateral damage to an innocent child. One afternoon, after Sarah had suffered a particularly severe anxiety attack following a custody exchange, made a decision. She contacted a local animal rescue organization and asked for a dog, not just any dog, but one with a calm temperament, one with an innate ability to sense emotional distress. Max had been surrendered to the shelter because his elderly owner had passed away. He was a purebred golden retriever, 3 years old, with a gentle disposition and an almost supernatural ability to read human emotions. When brought him to Sarah's house, she watched as the dog walked directly to the anxious child, pressed his warm body against her legs, and rested his head on her lap. Sarah's hand had moved instinctively to stroke his fur, and for the first time in months, her breathing had slowed. Her body had relaxed. Within days, a transformation began. Sarah still struggled. The court dates were still scheduled. The arguments between her parents continued. But when Sarah was with Max, she had moments of peace. She would lie on the floor with her head on the dog's side, feeling his heartbeat, his steady breathing. Max never judged her. He didn't take sides. He didn't argue. He simply existed in her presence, offering his warmth and loyalty unconditionally. Sarah started talking to Max in ways she talked to no one else. She whispered her fears to him. She confessed her confusion about her parents' hatred. She told him about the impossible position she felt caught in, unable to choose between the two people she loved most. Max listened with his entire being, his dark eyes never leaving her face, his ear occasionally twitching as if he were truly understanding every word. Now, sitting in the courthouse hallway, Sarah's hand rested on Max's head. The dog was calm and present, centered entirely on his girl. She could feel his solidarity, his protection. In the hallway outside the courtroom, with lawyers and judges and court documents swirling around her, Sarah had one anchor to reality: this dog who loved her unconditionally. She had no idea that in a few hours, Max would become far more than her emotional support. She didn't know that his presence would help her find a voice that trauma had stolen. She didn't understand that the bond between them was about to reveal truths that would echo through family courts across the country. Sarah squeezed Max's paw gently, a gesture she had developed instinctively, a private language between her and her most loyal friend. Max turned his head and licked her face once, gently. The courtroom doors remained closed, but Sarah's real testimony was about to begin. Judge had been a family law judge for 23 years. He had presided over more than 1,500 custody cases. He had seen marriages dissolve in acrimonious disputes. He had witnessed parents weaponize their children against each other. He had heard lies, half-truths, and strategic testimonies designed to manipulate rather than illuminate. But in all his years on the bench, he had never encountered a custody battle quite like the one involving Sarah and Michael Mitchell. The case had first arrived on his desk 6 months ago, filed as a relatively straightforward divorce with a custody dispute. On paper, it seemed routine. 2 educated, employed parents, 1 child, a disagreement about living arrangements and visitation schedules. Judge had seen similar cases dozens of times. Usually, they resolved through mediation or a standard custody arrangement. But this case had escalated in ways that were increasingly disturbing. Michael Mitchell's legal team, headed by the aggressive attorney Richard Thornton, had filed motions claiming that Jennifer was emotionally abusive, controlling, and deliberately alienating Sarah from her father. They presented psychological evaluations, suggesting that Jennifer had a personality disorder that made her unfit for primary custody. Thornton was ruthless in his strategy, painting Jennifer as a manipulator who had convinced Sarah to reject her father. In court filings, he used phrases like parental alienation, psychological harm, and unfit maternal instinct. Jennifer Mitchell's attorney, Susan, was equally fierce. She filed counter motions detailing instances of Michael's negligence, his frequent absences from Sarah's life, and his emotional unavailability even when he was present. She presented testimonies from teachers and neighbors, suggesting that Michael prioritized his career over his daughters. She argued that his infrequent phone calls, his missed birthday celebrations due to work trips, and his general detachment from Sarah's daily life demonstrated a lack of genuine parental investment. Countered that it wasn't Jennifer who was damaging Sarah, it was Michael's indifference. The courtroom had become a battlefield where every piece of evidence was weaponized, every document twisted to support one narrative or another. What neither attorney seemed to grasp was that, while they were busy fighting, a 7-year-old girl was suffering in the crossfire. Judge's first indication of the severity of the situation came during a preliminary hearing when Sarah's assigned guardian ad, Torres, presented her initial report. Ms. Torres was a seasoned professional with 15 years of experience advocating for children's interests in custody cases. She had interviewed Sarah, observed her in both parental homes, and reviewed her school records. The picture she painted was deeply concerning. "Your Honor," Ms. Torres had stated, her voice carrying the weight of professional concern, "I have significant worries about Sarah's emotional state. She is displaying signs of anxiety disorder, possible depression, and what appears to be trauma-related stress. The child is losing weight. She's experiencing sleep disturbances. Her academic performance has deteriorated. She exhibits avoidant behavior toward both parents, though for different reasons. With her mother, she seems to carry the emotional burden of her mother's sadness. With her father, she seems consumed by fear that he will abandon her further." Judge had leaned back in his chair, processing this information. He had reviewed countless reports like this before, but something about Ms. Torres' testimony resonated with particular gravity. When she finished, he had asked, "In your professional opinion, Ms. Torres, what is the primary cause of this child's distress?" Ms. Torres had hesitated only briefly before answering. "The conflict between the parents, Your Honor. Regardless of which parent is more at fault for the marital dissolution, the intensity and bitterness of their ongoing dispute is causing Sarah significant psychological harm. She is caught between two parents who are so focused on defeating each other that they cannot see the damage being inflicted on their daughter." Those words had stayed with Judge throughout the following weeks as the case proceeded toward full trial. Both Thornton and had prepared aggressively for their trial presentations. Each had lined up witnesses ready to testify against the opposing parent. Michael had prepared his testimony carefully, rehearsed answers to anticipated questions. Jennifer had done the same. They were both prepared to present themselves as the devoted parent, the reasonable one, the one who truly had Sarah's best interests at heart. But what neither of them seemed prepared for was the full courtroom presentation, scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late October. The courthouse itself seemed to reflect the tension of the case. The hallways were filled with quiet hostility. Michael sat on one side with his legal team. Jennifer sat on the other side with hers. They refused to make eye contact. They communicated through their attorneys. The air between them was thick with accumulated resentment. Sarah waited in the hallway with Ms. Torres and Max. The child was visibly distressed. She had hardly eaten breakfast. Her mother had insisted on the pink dress, which Sarah found uncomfortable. Her father had requested she wear the blue one, which her mother had refused. So the pink dress was a statement in itself, a casualty in the ongoing battle between her parents' preferences. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she sat on the wooden bench, her fingers buried in Max's golden fur. Ms. Torres watched the child with professional concern mixed with personal compassion. She had seen hundreds of children caught in custody disputes, but Sarah seemed particularly fragile. The anxiety was visible in every aspect of her posture. The way she held her shoulders hunched, the way her leg bounced nervously, the way her eyes darted nervously toward the courtroom doors, as if they might open at any moment to devour her. "Sarah," Ms. Torres said gently, "remember what we talked about. You just tell the judge the truth about how you feel. You don't have to choose between your mom and dad. You don't have to make anyone happy. You just need to be honest about what's in your heart. Okay." Sarah nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on Max. She reached down and made a subtle gesture with her hand, something Ms. Torres couldn't quite identify. The dog immediately pressed his body closer to the child, his head tilting slightly as if in perfect understanding of her unspoken needs. It was that moment that made Ms. Torres pause. She had observed many children with emotional support animals, but this was different. There seemed to be a genuine communication happening between Sarah and Max, not a trained behavior, but an actual dialogue. Sarah's hand movements seemed intentional, purposeful. The dog's responses seemed to reflect genuine comprehension rather than automatic reaction. Ms. Torres made a mental note. Something significant was occurring between this child and this dog, something that might be important for the judge to understand. At 10:47 a.m., the courtroom doors opened. Judge entered from his chambers. The attorneys rose. Michael and Jennifer straightened in their seats. The court clerk called the case. And then came the moment that would eventually become the turning point of everything. Ms. Torres approached the judge's bench and made her request. "Your Honor, I would like to request that the child be permitted to have her emotional support animal present during her testimony. I believe it will help facilitate her ability to communicate honestly and reduce her anxiety." Thornton immediately objected. "Your Honor, this is clearly an attempt to manipulate the court's emotions and bias the judge in favor of the defendant. Allowing an animal in the courtroom is highly irregular and prejudicial." But Ms. Torres pressed forward, explaining research about how companion animals help traumatized children communicate more openly. She described Sarah's severe anxiety symptoms. She made the case that the animal wasn't there to perform tricks or manipulate emotions, but to provide genuine emotional support during a traumatic process. Judge studied the hallway outside his courtroom through the window. He could see Sarah sitting with Max, the child's entire body language expressing terror. He could see the dog's unwavering focus on the girl, the absolute devotion and protection in the animal's posture. He turned back to the attorneys and made his decision. The animal will be permitted in the courtroom during the child's testimony. What Judge didn't yet understand was that he had just opened the door to one of the most remarkable legal revelations of his career. The idea had come to Sarah on a Tuesday night in August, during a particularly vicious argument between her parents. She was lying in bed, supposedly asleep, but the raised voices downstairs made sleep impossible. Her mother was accusing her father of not caring about Sarah's emotional needs. Her father was countering that her mother was poisoning Sarah against him, filling her head with lies about his absence and indifference. Both were shouting. Both were claiming to be the wronged party. Both were insisting that they had Sarah's best interests at heart, while simultaneously using her as ammunition in their warfare. That was when Sarah had a sudden, crystalline thought. What if nobody actually listened to what Sarah wanted? What if they were so focused on their own narratives that they couldn't hear her truth? She had gotten out of bed and gone to the window, where moonlight streamed through the glass. Max, who had been sleeping on his dog bed in the corner of Sarah's room, had immediately sensed her distress. He rose and walked over to her, pressing his head against her leg in that gentle way he had perfected over the previous months. Sarah had knelt down and buried her face in his golden fur and whispered something that surprised even her. "Max, I need to tell them how I really feel, but they won't listen." Nobody listens to kids. Max had licked her face, and in that moment, Sarah had made a decision. She would find a way to make them listen. She would develop a system that was so clear, so undeniable, that even her warring parents would have to acknowledge her authentic voice. That night, Sarah began her secret project. It started simply enough. The next morning, after her mother had left for work, Sarah sat on the kitchen floor with Max beside her. She had a notebook she used for school, and she began drawing pictures and writing down observations about Max. She noticed that he had specific behaviors for different emotional states. When he was content, his entire body relaxed. When he sensed her distress, he would press against her leg. When he was excited, he would perform a little play bow. These weren't trained commands. They were genuine emotional responses. Sarah began experimenting with subtle gestures. She discovered that when she touched Max's left ear gently while making eye contact, he would respond by tilting his head and appearing to listen intently. When she touched his right ear, he would nudge her hand with his nose. These weren't trained tricks. They were organic interactions that emerged naturally from their deepening bond. Over the following weeks, Sarah developed an increasingly sophisticated system. She created a private code with her dog, one that nobody else knew existed. It took hours of patient, gentle interaction, never forced, never uncomfortable for Max. Sarah was naturally intuitive about the dog's boundaries and comfort levels. She never pushed him to do anything that seemed stressful. Instead, she worked with his natural behaviors, rewarding genuine responses with affection and gentle praise. A touch to Max's ear while Sarah made a specific hand gesture meant happiness, security, safety. Max would respond by sitting perfectly still with an alert, content expression, his ears perked forward. A gentle squeeze of Max's paw while Sarah extended her other hand in a particular way signaled anxiety or fear. The dog would respond by lying down completely still, his head resting on his paws, his body absolutely calm, as if grounding Sarah through his steadiness. Sarah invented different signals for different emotional states. She created a hand movement that meant, "I want to stay," an opening of her palms and a specific gesture toward herself. When she made this signal, Max would lie down and place his head on her lap, creating a physical anchor. She developed another signal that meant, "I feel safe," a circular motion with her hand. Max would respond by standing and leaning his entire body weight against her, providing pressure that she had read in one of her mother's psychology books was therapeutic for anxiety. The most important signal, the one Sarah practiced the most, was the one that meant, "I'm telling the truth." For this one, Sarah would make a three-motion gesture with both hands in a specific pattern, and she would look directly into Max's eyes. The dog would respond by coming directly to her, placing both paws on her shoulders, an unusual behavior that Sarah had carefully encouraged, and making direct eye contact while remaining absolutely still. It was as if Max was saying, "I hear you. I believe you. I am here to validate your truth." Sarah kept detailed notes in a notebook she hid under her mattress. She documented each signal, each response, each variation. She drew pictures of Max in different positions. She wrote out the meanings of each gesture. Some nights, she would take out the notebook and review her work, making sure she could reproduce each signal consistently. What Sarah didn't realize was that she was engaging in sophisticated emotional and behavioral psychology. She was unconsciously understanding that nonverbal communication could transcend the verbal battles that had defined her family's conflict. She was creating a system that would allow her to express truths that her trauma and anxiety had made impossible to articulate in words. The training intensified after the first custody hearing, when Sarah heard her mother tell her therapist that the judge is going to decide what's best for Sarah because clearly she can't speak for herself. That phrase had struck Sarah like a physical blow. Couldn't speak for herself. She had tried to speak. She had tried to express her feelings, but her voice came out weak and confused. The emotions were too big, too complicated. Her parents' narratives were too powerful. So she had doubled down on her secret work with Max. By October, when the second court date was scheduled, Sarah and Max had developed an almost telepathic connection. They could communicate through the subtlest gestures. Sarah's signals had become so refined that an outside observer might not even notice them happening. A barely perceptible touch, a slight hand movement, a specific direction of her gaze, and Max would respond with equally subtle behaviors, a shift in his body weight, a specific ear position, a change in his breathing pattern. Tors, Sarah's grandmother, had noticed something was different about Sarah and Max's interaction, but she attributed it to deepening bonding rather than intentional training. She noticed that Sarah seemed calmer after spending time with Max. She observed that the dog responded to Sarah's emotional states with uncanny accuracy. But she didn't understand that Sarah had deliberately created this system. To her, it appeared to be a natural, spontaneous connection between a traumatized child and her supportive animal. Sarah kept her secret carefully hidden. She never practiced the signals when anyone else was watching. She never discussed them with anyone. The signals existed in the private space between her and Max, a sacred language that belonged only to them. On the night before the trial, Sarah lay in bed with Max beside her, and she went through each signal one more time. She needed to be perfect. She needed the judge to understand. She needed her parents to finally hear what she was really feeling beneath all the adult noise and adult anger. She practiced the signal for truth over and over, making eye contact with Max, watching as he responded with absolute consistency and conviction. "Tomorrow," she whispered to the dog, "you're going to help me tell them. You're going to help me be brave." Max rested his head on her chest, his heartbeat steady and strong. In the darkness of her bedroom, Sarah realized that she wasn't going into that courtroom alone. She had Max. She had their language. She had a voice that nobody could dismiss or manipulate. She was ready. The courtroom was silent as Sarah walked through the heavy wooden doors, Max padding quietly beside her. The room seemed impossibly large to her 7-year-old eyes, much larger than it had appeared during the preliminary hearing. The judge's bench loomed at the front like a dark wooden fortress. The gallery was filled with people, her parents' attorneys, court reporters, a psychologist, social workers, and observers. Everyone's eyes turned toward her as she entered. Judge studied the small girl and the large golden dog. Even he, with his 23 years of judicial experience, felt something shift in the room. There was a quality to their entrance that transcended the typical courtroom drama. Sarah wasn't walking like a child being led to testify. She was walking like someone with a specific purpose, someone who had prepared for this moment in ways that went beyond what a 7-year-old should have to prepare for. Sarah was sworn in. She placed her small hand on the Bible and repeated after the clerk, I do solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God." Her voice was barely audible, but it was clear, deliberate. Max was positioned on a cushion beside the witness stand, close enough for Sarah to reach him if she needed to, but not so close as to be disruptive. Judge had insisted on this arrangement, overruling Richard Thornton's objections one final time. The judge had sensed something in Ms. Torr's presentation, something that made him believe this unconventional arrangement might reveal important truths. Susan, Jennifer's attorney, went first with her questions. She was gentle in her approach, understanding that she was questioning a traumatized child who was also her client's daughter. "Sarah, I want you to know that this is a safe place to tell the truth," Ms. began. "Can you tell the judge what it's like when you're at home with your mom?" Sarah opened her mouth to answer, but her voice caught. Her small hands trembled. She glanced down at Max, and almost imperceptibly, she reached over and touched his ear with her left hand while making a subtle gesture with her right. Her fingers extended in a specific pattern that only she and Max understood. Max immediately shifted position, his entire body relaxing. He turned his head slightly towards Sarah, his ears perking forward in that alert, attentive expression they had practiced hundreds of times. The connection was so natural, so genuine, that no one in the courtroom could dismiss it as performance. Something in Sarah's posture changed. Her shoulders dropped slightly. Her breathing seemed to deepen. "When I'm with my mom," Sarah said, her voice growing slightly stronger, "I feel like I have to take care of her. She cries a lot. She talks about my dad being mean. And I don't know what to say because I love my dad. But when I say that, my mom gets sad and I don't want to hurt her feelings." It was the first genuinely articulate thing Sarah had said since the proceedings began. Judge leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued. Ms. continued with several more questions, and Sarah answered them with increasing coherence. But what was remarkable wasn't just her words, it was the signals. Throughout her testimony, Sarah would make subtle gestures to Max whenever she felt overwhelmed by emotion or uncertainty. Each time, the dog would respond with the exact behavior they had practiced. And each time, Sarah seemed to regain access to her authentic voice. Then Richard Thornton stood to cross-examine. His approach was immediately different from Ms.'s. He was more aggressive, more probing. His questions were designed to elicit specific answers that would support his narrative about Jennifer's parental alienation. "Sarah," Thornton began, his voice carrying a subtle edge, "has your mother ever told you that your father doesn't love you?" The question landed like a physical blow. Sarah's entire body stiffened. Her eyes widened. Her hands clenched into fists in her lap. For a moment, she couldn't respond. The anxiety was visible on her face. Judge almost intervened, but he paused. He wanted to see what would happen next. Sarah reached down and squeezed Max's paw, the signal for anxiety that they had practiced so many times. Her other hand moved in the specific pattern they had developed together. Max immediately responded by lying completely still, his entire body becoming a grounding force for the traumatized child. The dog's steadiness seemed to anchor Sarah back to reality. "My mom never said that exactly," Sarah said slowly, but sometimes she says things that make me think maybe he doesn't care about me as much. Like when she says he missed my recital and he never cared about my soccer games. And then I get scared that he doesn't love me." "And do you think your mother is telling you the truth?" Thornton pressed. This was the crucial moment. Sarah took a deep breath. She looked directly at Max and she made the gesture, the three-motion hand signal they had practiced hundreds of times, the signal for truth. Her hands moved in the specific pattern, open palms outward, then a circular motion, then both hands pressed to her chest. Max stood up, and in perfect synchronization with Sarah's signal, he placed both of his front paws on her shoulders, his head at exactly her eye level. His dark eyes locked with hers. He remained absolutely still, in complete physical contact with her, creating a moment of such genuine connection that the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. "My dad loves me," Sarah said, her voice steady and clear for the first time in the entire proceeding. "I know he does. But I'm scared because my mom is sad, and I think it's because of my dad, and I don't know how to make her not sad. And I'm scared my dad will stop visiting because the fighting is too hard." Thornton tried several more aggressive approaches, but each time Sarah felt overwhelmed, she would signal Max. Each time, the dog would respond. The pattern became increasingly obvious to everyone in the courtroom. This was not a trained performance. This was genuine communication between a child and an animal who had somehow developed the ability to sense and respond to her emotional states with remarkable precision. When Thornton finally sat down, looking frustrated by his inability to manipulate the testimony, Jennifer's face was streaked with tears. She had just heard her daughter's authentic voice, and what Sarah had expressed was more complex and heartbreaking than either parent had fully grasped. Sarah wasn't choosing one parent over another. She wasn't being manipulated. She was expressing genuine love for both parents while simultaneously expressing genuine terror about their conflict. Ms. Torres asked a few follow-up questions designed to clarify Sarah's emotional state. Each time, Sarah used her signals. Each time, Max responded. The gallery watched with a mixture of fascination and emotion. This wasn't typical courtroom testimony. This was something unprecedented. A child finding her voice through her connection with an animal that had somehow learned to speak her emotional language. Judge watched everything carefully, taking notes. He was witnessing something that he knew was significant, something that transcended typical custody case evidence. He was watching a traumatized child reclaim her voice through nonverbal communication with an animal who had learned to understand and validate her emotional truth. When Sarah finally stepped down from the witness stand, she was visibly exhausted. Max remained pressed against her leg as she walked back to sit beside Ms. Torres. But there was something different in her posture now. She had spoken her truth. She had been heard. And Judge had just realized that everything he thought he knew about this custody case was about to change. The silence that followed Sarah's testimony was profound and unprecedented. In Judge's 23 years on the bench, he had never experienced a moment quite like this one. The courtroom, which moments before had been filled with the subtle tension of legal maneuvering and strategic questioning, had transformed into something sacred, a space where truth had been spoken so clearly that all artifice had momentarily fallen away. Judge's court reporter sat frozen, her fingers still poised above her keyboard. The two attorneys remained seated, neither one moving to speak or object. Jennifer Mitchell had her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes streaming with tears. Michael Mitchell sat rigidly in his chair, his face pale, his own eyes glistening. For the first time since the proceedings began, the conflict between them seemed insignificant compared to the reality of their daughter's suffering. Sarah remained seated beside Ms. Torres, her small hand resting on Max's head. The dog hadn't moved from his protective position. He seemed to understand that the moment required absolute stillness, absolute presence. His dark eyes occasionally glanced up at Sarah as if checking to ensure she was okay, that the ordeal had passed. Ms. Torres, the guardian ad, sat stunned beside Sarah. She had suspected that something unusual was occurring between the girl and her dog, but witnessing it firsthand, in this context, was overwhelming. She had been present during Sarah's testimony as an observer and advocate, and what she had just witnessed transcended her professional experience. This wasn't just a child with an emotional support animal. This was a child who had somehow developed a profound, almost telepathic connection with an animal, a connection that had allowed her to access her deepest emotional truths in a way that words alone never could have achieved. Judge was the first to move. He carefully set down his pen and removed his reading glasses, rubbing his eyes. He looked at Sarah for a long moment, studying her as if trying to understand how a 7-year-old girl could possess such emotional sophistication, such self-awareness, such courage. "We will take a recess," Judge announced, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of emotion. 30 minutes. I want to see counsel in my chambers before we proceed further." As the courtroom began to empty, Richard Thornton and Susan immediately began gathering their materials, but their usual professional composure seemed shaken. Both attorneys had sensed that something fundamental had shifted. The traditional adversarial approach to custody litigation suddenly seemed crude and inadequate in the face of what they had just witnessed. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Sarah was immediately surrounded by well-meaning adults. A social worker approached to check on her emotional state. A court-appointed psychologist wanted to ask her several follow-up questions. Ms. Torres had to politely but firmly create a protective barrier around the child. "Sarah needs space right now," Ms. Torres said gently but with clear authority. "She's emotionally exhausted. The best thing we can do for her is allow her quiet time with Max." Sarah's mother approached hesitantly, as if uncertain whether she had the right to comfort her own daughter. Jennifer's eyes were red and swollen. She looked at Sarah with an expression of such profound regret and love that Sarah's own eyes filled with fresh tears. "I'm sorry," Jennifer said, her voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I didn't realize. I didn't know how much my sadness was hurting you." Sarah reached out and hugged her mother, but her other hand remained on Max's head. The dog stayed completely still, providing silent support through physical presence. Michael watched from across the hallway, his own emotions clearly overwhelming him. He hadn't had the chance to hear his daughter's authentic voice in so long that her testimony felt like a miracle. Inside Judge's chambers, the atmosphere was markedly different from the typical post-hearing attorney meeting. The judge sat behind his massive wooden desk, but his posture was less formal than usual. He gestured for Thornton and to sit. "What I witnessed out there," Judge began slowly, "transcended typical courtroom testimony. I want both of you to be very clear on something. I was not moved by the presence of the dog or by any emotional manipulation. What I observed was a child communicating with profound honesty about her genuine emotional state. That communication appeared to occur through a systematic nonverbal language that she and the animal have somehow developed." Leaned forward slightly. "Your Honor, if I may, I think what we witnessed was Sarah finally feeling safe enough to express her true feelings. The dog provided the emotional grounding she needed to overcome her trauma response." "Precisely," Judge nodded. "And Mr. Thornton, I trust you recognize that your cross-examination tactics, while legally appropriate in other contexts, were fundamentally incompatible with what this child actually needs." Thornton's jaw tightened. "Your Honor, I was attempting to establish the facts relevant to parental fitness." "The facts you were attempting to establish," Judge interrupted, "were irrelevant to the actual issue before this court. The issue is not which parent is more at fault for the marital dissolution. The issue is what Sarah Mitchell needs to heal and thrive. And what Sarah Mitchell needs, based on her own testimony, is for both parents to stop using her as a weapon in their conflict." The judge stood and walked to a window overlooking the courthouse plaza. "I am going to order a psychiatric evaluation of Sarah to be conducted by an independent evaluator. I want detailed documentation of her current emotional and physical health status. I also want both parents evaluated for their capacity to engage in genuine co-parenting. And I want Ms. Torres to provide weekly reports on Sarah's for the next 3 months." He turned back to face the attorneys. "But I want to make something very clear. If either parent continues to engage in high-conflict behavior, if either parent attempts to alienate the child from the other parent, if either parent fails to prioritize this child's emotional above their own need to win, there will be consequences. Significant consequences. This is no longer about custody arrangements. This is about a child's mental health and emotional survival." Back in the hallway, Sarah sat quietly with Max, eating a small snack that Ms. Torres had brought her. The girl's exhaustion was evident in every aspect of her physical being. The emotional labor of testimony had drained her completely. "You were very brave in there," Ms. Torres said gently, sitting beside her. "Max helped me," Sarah said softly. "Yes, he did," Ms. Torres agreed. "And I think the judge understood that. I think what you and Max showed the judge was something very important about how you feel and what you need." Sarah looked up at Ms. Torres with eyes that seemed far too old for a 7-year-old's face. "Are my parents going to stop fighting now?" "I don't know yet," Ms. Torres said honestly. "But I think what you said today might help them understand something important. You showed them that their fighting is hurting you, and I think that might change things." Sarah rested her head on Max's back, and the dog immediately adjusted his position to provide maximum comfort. In that moment, surrounded by the noise and chaos of the courthouse hallway, they created a small island of peace and connection. Jennifer and Michael both watched from a distance, neither approaching, but both observing the child they had created and the animal who had somehow become her voice. They were beginning to understand something that would take weeks of therapy and counseling to fully process. Their daughter was not a prize to be won. She was a human being, a remarkably intelligent, emotionally sophisticated human being, who was desperately asking them to love her enough to stop their war. And that request, delivered through the nonverbal language of a girl and her dog, was more powerful than any legal argument either attorney could have constructed. That evening, after court had adjourned, Judge sat alone in his chambers with a cup of cold coffee and the video recording of Sarah's testimony. He had requested that the court technician prepare the footage immediately. And now, in the solitude of his office with the sun setting over the courthouse plaza, he watched the recording again, and again, and again. Each viewing revealed something new. On the first viewing, he was struck by the emotional power of the moment. On the second, he began to notice the subtle mechanics of Sarah's communication system, the precise hand movements, the specific touch points on Max's body, the dog's consistent responses. On the third viewing, he realized he was witnessing something genuinely extraordinary. This wasn't learned behavior. This was a sophisticated emotional language that a 7-year-old child had somehow created with her animal companion. Judge paused the video at the moment when Sarah made the truth signal, her hands moving in that specific 3-part gesture, while her eyes locked with Max's. The dog's response was instantaneous and perfect, both paws rising to Sarah's shoulders, his entire body language expressing unwavering support and validation. The judge rewound and watched that moment 5 more times. Each time, his sense of awe deepened. He had dedicated his career to understanding families, to interpreting evidence, to discerning truth from manipulation. But what he was witnessing transcended all of that. This was a child who had discovered a way to bypass the psychological barriers that trauma and anxiety had erected. This was a child who had given herself permission to be honest by filtering her truth through a being she trusted completely. Judge made notes on a legal pad. His handwriting, usually precise and formal, became increasingly animated. The communication between Sarah Mitchell and her dog exhibits characteristics of genuine emotional dialogue rather than trained performance. Key observations: 1. Consistency of responses. Each signal produces identical behavioral responses across multiple trials. 2. Appropriateness of responses. The dog's behavior directly corresponds to the emotional content Sarah is expressing. 3. Natural integration. The signals occur spontaneously without prompting or external reward. 4. Authenticity. This appears to be genuine communication, not performance behavior. He paused and added, "This child has demonstrated remarkable emotional intelligence and psychological sophistication. She has intuitively understood that her anxiety and trauma were preventing her from accessing her own voice, and she has created a systematic solution. The dog serves as an emotional translator, a being through which Sarah can express what she cannot express directly." At 9 p.m., Judge called the court-appointed psychologist doctor at her home. It was unconventional. Judges typically didn't call experts outside of official proceedings, but Judge felt the urgency of what he needed to communicate. "Doctor, I'm calling because I need your professional perspective on something I observed during Sarah Mitchell's testimony," he began without preamble. "I need you to watch the video recording and tell me your clinical assessment of what occurred between the child and her animal." The next morning, Doctor came to Judge's chambers with her own notes. Her assessment was both professional and deeply moved. "Your Honor, what I observed in that testimony is remarkable," Doctor began. "This child has intuitively created a coping mechanism that bypasses her conscious anxiety. By focusing on communicating with the dog rather than directly answering questions, She has given her subconscious permission to access her authentic emotional truth. The animal serves as an emotional intermediary, a neutral third party through which her trauma-suppressed voice can emerge. In your professional opinion, could this communication system have been deliberately trained or coached? Judge asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. Doctor shook her head firmly. Absolutely not. What we're observing requires the kind of emotional intelligence and intuitive understanding that cannot be artificially created. This appears to be a spontaneous psychological adaptation developed by a highly intelligent child responding to extreme stress. If anything, this demonstrates Sarah's remarkable resilience and capacity for self-protection. Judge nodded, satisfied. I want documentation of all of this in writing. I want your clinical assessment of Sarah's emotional state, your professional opinion on the significance of this communication system, and your recommendations for her ongoing psychological care. Over the following days, Judge did something unprecedented in his judicial practice. He began documenting the case not just in traditional legal language, but with extensive clinical and psychological notation. He worked with Ms. Torres to observe Sarah in multiple settings: at school, at her mother's home, at her father's home. He requested that each observation be specifically documented with attention to Sarah's use of her signals with Max and the dog's responses. What emerged was a comprehensive psychological and legal record of a child's remarkable adaptation to trauma. The documentation revealed that Sarah's signal system was not random or inconsistent. It was highly organized, deeply meaningful, and profoundly authentic. Judge also ordered a comprehensive evaluation of the human-animal bond. He requested research on how animals could become emotional anchors for traumatized children. He studied literature on nonverbal communication, emotional intelligence in children, and the therapeutic applications of companion animals in high-stress situations. One afternoon, Ms. Torres brought Sarah to Judge's chambers, an unusual and highly irregular occurrence. The judge sat behind his desk, but he motioned for Sarah to sit in the chair across from him rather than maintaining formal distance. "Sarah, I want you to know something," Judge said gently. "What you did in that courtroom was one of the bravest things I've witnessed in my entire career. You found a way to tell the truth when telling the truth felt impossible. Do you understand how special that is?" Sarah looked up at him with her solemn, old-beyond-her-years eyes. "Max helped me," she said simply. "Yes, he did," Judge agreed. "And I want you to know that I understand now what Max means to you. Max isn't just a dog. Max is your voice. Max is your truth. And for that reason, Max will always be with you, no matter what happens with your family arrangements." He made a note on his legal pad. Protective order. The dog Max is deemed essential to Sarah Mitchell's emotional and psychological stability. Removal of the animal from Sarah's care would constitute psychological harm. The animal will remain with Sarah at all times. Later that week, Judge met privately with both Jennifer and Michael Mitchell. He showed them the video of Sarah's testimony, not to persuade them toward a particular custody arrangement, but to help them truly see their daughters suffering for the first time. Jennifer broke down completely within the first minute of watching. Seeing her daughter's anxiety, hearing her express the burden of her mother's sadness, it was devastatingly clear evidence of the harm her own emotional state had inflicted on her child. Michael watched with tears streaming down his face. He had known Sarah was struggling, but he had been so caught up in defending himself against accusations of abandonment that he hadn't truly grasped the depth of his daughter's fear that he might stop loving her. "I want both of you to understand something," Judge said when the video finished. "This child has created a psychological survival mechanism. She has literally taught herself a new language because the normal channels of communication had become unsafe. That is extraordinary and tragic in equal measure. Your job now is not to fight over who gets to raise her. Your job is to create an environment where she never needs to create psychological survival mechanisms again." Judge began crafting his written decision with exceptional care. He cited research on child trauma. He referenced doctors' psychological assessment. He included extensive documentation of Sarah's emotional state and the significance of her communication system with Max. He made clear that his ruling was not about legal technicalities or custody law precedent. His ruling was about one child's desperate cry for peace, delivered through the most unlikely but most powerful voice available to her, her dog. By the time he finished writing, Judge knew his decision would be unconventional. It would be cited in legal journals. It would become a reference point for family law. But more importantly, it would transform one child's life. And that, he understood, was what justice really meant. The courthouse was packed on the day Judge delivered his decision. Word had spread through legal circles that something unprecedented was about to occur. Family law attorneys from neighboring counties had requested permission to observe. 3 law professors from the state university sat in the back of the gallery, laptops ready to document what they sensed would be landmark jurisprudence. Court reporters from the local legal newspaper were present, ready to capture every word. Judge entered from his chambers at precisely 10 a.m., his black robes flowing behind him. He took his seat at the bench, and the courtroom fell silent. He adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Sarah, who sat between Jennifer and Michael. The girl clutched Max's leash tightly, the dog's presence providing the anchoring calm that had become essential to her stability. "This case," Judge began, his voice steady and carrying the weight of careful consideration, presents circumstances that transcend traditional family law precedent. The issues before this court are not merely about custody arrangements or visitation schedules. They are fundamentally about a child's emotional survival and psychological in the face of parental conflict. He paused, allowing the gravity of his words to settle over the courtroom. I have reviewed the testimony provided by the minor child, Sarah Mitchell. I have considered the psychological evaluations conducted by Dr. I have examined the observations made by guardian ad tours, and I have personally reviewed video documentation of the child's testimony multiple times. What emerges from this comprehensive review is a picture of a child who is not suffering from parental alienation, as one party suggested. Rather, what we have is a child suffering from the acute trauma of witnessing parental conflict and feeling personally responsible for ameliorating the emotional suffering of both parents. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. The child demonstrated remarkable emotional intelligence and psychological sophistication through her communication with her companion animal, Max, Judge continued. In fact, the child's ability to articulate her genuine emotional needs through nonverbal communication with the animal revealed truths about her psychological state that might never have emerged through traditional testimony alone. This demonstrates that this particular child requires an unconventional approach to litigation, an approach that honors her unique communicative style and respects her demonstrated capacity for emotional honesty. A judge leaned forward, his gaze fixed on the two attorneys. I am making several determinations in this case. First, regarding custody. Rather than awarding primary custody to either parent, I am implementing a detailed shared custody arrangement. Sarah will reside with her mother, Jennifer Mitchell, Monday through Friday during the school week. She will reside with her father, Michael Mitchell, every weekend and for extended periods during school breaks and summer vacation. This arrangement is designed to minimize disruption to Sarah's education, while ensuring both parents maintain significant involvement in her daily life. Thornton began to rise to object, but Judge raised his hand sharply. I am not finished. Second, and of paramount importance to this decision, both parents will immediately enroll in court-ordered co-parenting counseling. This counseling will focus specifically on reducing conflict and establishing healthy communication patterns. Any violation of the co-parenting agreements established through this counseling, any attempt to undermine the other parent's relationship with Sarah, any high-conflict behavior witnessed in Sarah's presence or communicated to Sarah, will result in immediate modification of custody arrangements, potentially involving residential placement outside the home. Jennifer visibly trembled. Michael's jaw clenched. Third, regarding the animal, I am issuing a protective order designating Max as an essential component of Sarah's psychological. Max will accompany Sarah during all custody transitions between homes. Neither parent will interfere with the child's access to this animal. The dog's presence is not optional or supplementary. It is medically and psychologically necessary for this child's emotional stability and continued mental health. This designation, formally recognizing a dog's essential medical role in a child's psychology, was unprecedented. Pens moved rapidly across notepads in the gallery as attorneys and professors documented this historic moment. Fourth, I am requiring both parents to participate in individual therapy focused on their own emotional patterns and their ability to prioritize their daughters above their own need for victory in this conflict. The parents must recognize that this child is not a prize to be won, but a human being requiring peace and stability. Judge adjusted his glasses and continued. Fifth, I am appointing doctor as the child's treating psychologist, with authority to provide therapy and recommendations regarding the family's progress. Doctor will submit quarterly reports to this court documenting Sarah's emotional progress and any concerns requiring judicial intervention. He opened the formal written decision that had taken him 2 weeks to compose. The document was substantial, 47 pages of legal reasoning, psychological analysis, clinical observations, and citations to research on child trauma and human-animal bonding. The written decision accompanying this oral ruling, Judge stated, details the specific provisions of the custody arrangement, including schedules, financial obligations, educational decision-making authority, and protocols for communicating regarding Sarah's. Both parents will receive copies. Both parents will be required to sign acknowledgments of understanding and agreement to comply with all provisions. He looked directly at Sarah for a long moment. This court recognizes that this child has demonstrated extraordinary courage and emotional intelligence. Sarah Mitchell has given this court a profound gift, the gift of her authentic voice, delivered through her own carefully developed communicative system. In return, this court commits to creating an environment where she never has to develop psychological survival mechanisms again. This court commits to ensuring that both her parents understand their primary obligation, to create safety and peace for this child. Judge's gaze shifted to Sarah's parents. Michael and Jennifer Mitchell, you created this child together. You share responsibility for her emotional. Your failure to manage your own conflict has caused demonstrable harm to your daughter. This court is giving you the opportunity to correct that harm. This court is making clear that future conflict will have serious consequences, including potential modification of custody arrangements. But this court is also giving you hope. Hope that through counseling, through genuine commitment to co-parenting, and through prioritizing your daughter's needs above your own, you can become the parent Sarah deserves. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Some observers had tears streaming down their faces. The other significant aspect of this decision, Judge continued, is that this ruling will become part of the public record. This case will likely be published in legal journals and cited in future custody proceedings. It is my intention that Sarah's story, delivered through her own voice and her remarkable communication with her animal companion, will serve as an educational tool for other judges, other attorneys, and other parents. This case demonstrates that sometimes the most important truths cannot be expressed through conventional language. Sometimes we must listen with our hearts rather than our ears. Sometimes we must recognize that children possess wisdom that adults have forgotten, the wisdom of emotional honesty. Judge signed the formal decision with careful precision, his signature authoritative and final. "This court is adjourned," he announced, striking his gavel gently, not harshly, but with finality. "I will expect both parents in my chambers in 1 week for a status conference. I will expect documentation of enrollment in co-parenting and individual counseling by that time. This court will monitor compliance closely." As Judge rose to return to his chambers, something remarkable happened. The courtroom remained silent, but it was not the silence of legal formality. It was the silence of witnessing something profound, something that transcended the typical adversarial framework of litigation. People sat motionless, processing what they had just experienced. Sarah reached over and made her signal to Max, the gesture for safety and security. The dog responded by resting his head firmly on her lap, providing the grounding that the girl needed as her world fundamentally shifted. For the first time in over a year, both of Sarah's parents were aligned in a single purpose. They had both just been told, with unmistakable judicial clarity, that their daughter's needs mattered more than their own conflict. And remarkably, hearing it stated so clearly, supported by psychological evidence, and delivered with such moral authority, began to crack the armor of defensiveness that had protected each parent's sense of righteousness. Outside the courtroom, reporters immediately began crafting headlines. Judge creates historic precedent recognizing dog's medical role in child's mental health. Custody case transformed by child's nonverbal communication with animal companion. Judge's landmark decision prioritizes child's emotional needs over parental rights. But for Sarah, walking out of the courthouse with her hand on Max's head and both parents flanking her on either side, for the first time walking together rather than in opposing formations, what mattered was something simpler and more profound. The fighting might finally stop. 6 months after Judge's historic decision, Sarah Mitchell stood in the gymnasium of Lincoln Elementary School, dressed in a pink and purple outfit that she had chosen herself, not because her mother insisted or her father preferred, but because it made her happy. The gymnasium was filled with people. Her classmates, their parents, teachers, school administrators, and several unfamiliar faces that Sarah would soon learn were journalists and legal professionals who had traveled to Portland, specifically to hear her speak. Ms. Henderson, Sarah's second-grade teacher, introduced her with visible emotion. "This young woman has a very special story to share with you today about the importance of animals in helping us express our feelings. She's also going to demonstrate something quite remarkable, a unique form of communication she developed with her dog Max." Sarah took the microphone, her small hand barely able to grip it. Max sat beside her on the gymnasium floor, calm and attentive. The audience of approximately 200 people fell silent, waiting. "My name is Sarah Mitchell," she began, her voice stronger and more confident than it had been in the courtroom months earlier. "I want to tell you about Max and how he helped me find my voice." As Sarah spoke, she told her story with the unself-conscious honesty that only a child can achieve. She described her parents fighting, her anxiety, her fear that the conflict was her fault. She talked about losing her appetite and having trouble sleeping. She explained how Max had become her friend when everything else felt scary and broken. "But Max did something more than just being my friend," Sarah continued. "Max helped me learn a special language. When I couldn't say words because I was too scared or too sad, I could show Max how I felt with signals, and Max would show me that he understood." Sarah then proceeded to demonstrate the signals that had captivated a judge and transformed a family law case. She touched Max's ear while making a specific hand gesture, and the dog responded with his alert, attentive expression. She squeezed his paw, and Max became completely still and grounded. She made the truth signal, the three-motion gesture, and Max placed his paws on her shoulders, their eyes locked in perfect understanding. The gymnasium erupted in applause, but it wasn't the applause of people watching a trained dog perform tricks. It was the applause of people who had just witnessed something profoundly authentic, a child and an animal speaking a language of emotional honesty. "When I talked to the judge," Sarah explained, "Max was with me. And Max helped me tell the truth about how much I loved both my parents and how scared I was about their fighting." The judge listened, and then my parents started listening too. As Sarah spoke, both Jennifer and Michael Mitchell sat in the front row, their eyes filled with tears. Neither was trying to hide their emotion. They had learned, through months of counseling, to be vulnerable with each other in ways they never had been before. "The most important thing I want to tell you," Sarah concluded, is that when you're scared or sad or have big feelings that are hard to say with words, there are other ways to share those feelings. You can draw them. You can dance them. You can share them with animals or with people you trust. You don't have to keep big feelings locked inside. There's always a way to let them out, and there are always people and animals who will listen. The applause that followed was thunderous. Teachers stood. Parents wiped tears. Other children looked at Sarah with a mixture of awe and recognition, awe at her courage, and recognition of the universal truth she had articulated. Over the following weeks, Sarah's story went viral in ways that neither she nor her parents could have anticipated. Legal journals published Judge's decision, accompanied by articles about the unprecedented recognition of an animal's therapeutic role in a custody case. News outlets ran feature stories about Sarah and Max. Universities began using the case in their family law courses. Other judges, facing their own difficult custody cases, began to consider whether they were truly listening to children's authentic needs or merely processing custody through traditional legal frameworks. But more importantly, Sarah's story impacted the lives of the people closest to her. Jennifer Mitchell underwent a profound transformation. Her therapy sessions revealed that her own childhood trauma had manifested as anxiety and depression that she had unconsciously transmitted to her daughter. By acknowledging her own emotional patterns and taking responsibility for her behavior, Jennifer began to heal. She continued her teaching career with renewed passion, and more importantly, she became the mother she had always wanted to be: present, emotionally available, and capable of supporting her daughter's genuine emotional needs rather than requiring her daughter to support her own. Michael Mitchell, confronted with clear evidence that his emotional distance had caused his daughter pain, made significant changes to his professional life. He reduced his business travel, delegating more responsibility to junior architects. He attended every school event. He engaged in genuine dialogue with his daughter, asking her questions and truly listening to her answers. He joined Jennifer in co-parenting counseling and discovered that beneath his defensive posture was genuine love for his daughter that he had simply expressed poorly. By the 6-month mark, the custody arrangement was working smoothly. Sarah transitioned between homes without anxiety attacks. She ate properly. She slept through the night. Her academic performance improved dramatically. Her friendships deepened. She laughed more than she cried. Max, the dog who had inadvertently become a catalyst for profound family transformation, became something of a celebrity himself. He was invited to speak at animal therapy conferences. His story was featured in veterinary journals exploring the therapeutic applications of companion animals. But to Sarah, Max remained simply what he had always been: her best friend, her emotional anchor, her voice when words felt impossible. One evening, as Sarah did homework at her mother's kitchen table with Max resting his head on her lap, Jennifer sat down beside her daughter. "I want to apologize," Jennifer said gently, "for putting you in the middle of my sadness, for making you feel responsible for my emotions, for not being the mother you deserved during that difficult time." Sarah looked up from her homework. "It's okay, Mom, you're better now, and I'm better too." "We're better together," Jennifer agreed, reaching over to pet Max. "All three of us." The following weekend, Michael picked Sarah up for their time together, and they drove to a local park. Sarah walked between her parents, literally in the middle, but no longer feeling trapped. Max walked alongside her, his presence a constant comfort. "I have something to tell you both," Sarah announced as they walked. "I don't think I need the signals with Max anymore. I mean, I still like talking to him that way because it's our special language, but I think I can say words now." Jennifer and Michael exchanged glances. Their daughter was right. Over the past 6 months, Sarah had gradually begun to rely less on her nonverbal communication system. She had developed confidence in her own voice. She could express her needs and feelings in traditional language. The signals had served their crucial purpose. They had given her a way to access her truth when conventional communication felt impossible. But as she healed, she had the need for that intermediary. "I think that's wonderful," Michael said, reaching over to squeeze his daughter's shoulder. "But I'll still have my special language with Max," Sarah clarified, "because I like talking to him that way. It makes me feel close to him." Judge learned of Sarah's progress through Ms. Torres, who continued to monitor her as required by the court. He received periodic updates about the family's healing. When he learned that Sarah was thriving, both emotionally and academically, he made a note in his personal files. "This case," he wrote, "represented the essence of what family law should be, not about winning and losing, but about protecting the most vulnerable and creating conditions for healing and growth." 3 years later, when Sarah was 10 years old, she was invited to speak at a national family law conference. She stood before 500 attorneys, judges, and social workers and told her story. She no longer needed Max by her side to speak her truth. Her own voice had become strong enough to carry her message. But Max was there anyway, sitting calmly beside the podium, providing silent support. "When I was 7, Sarah told the assembled legal professionals, "I thought my parents fighting was the biggest problem in my life. But the real problem was that nobody was really listening to me. They were listening to lawyers. They were listening to their own pain. They were listening to their anger. But nobody was listening to what I actually needed." She paused, looking directly at the judges in the audience. "I'm grateful to Judge because he listened, not just with his ears but with his heart. He understood that sometimes children need to be heard in different ways, and he changed the law because of it. Sarah concluded her speech with a message that would resonate with the family law community for years to come. I learned that when people stop fighting and start listening to each other, really listening, amazing things can happen. My family didn't have to stay broken. We just needed someone who was willing to listen to the truth, even when that truth came from a 7-year-old girl and her dog. That night, as Sarah returned home with her parents and Max, she understood something that most adults never fully grasp. She had been broken, but she wasn't broken anymore. Her family had been at war, but peace had emerged. She had found her voice, and in doing so, she had helped her parents find theirs. Max, sensing her contentment, rested his head on her lap one final time, the same gesture he had made thousands of times over the past 3 years. But now it meant something different. It meant, we made it through. We're all going to be okay. And Sarah, running her fingers through his golden fur, knew it was true.